All right. Okay, wonderful. Welcome everyone to this Sunday afternoon book launch of the 6th Democratic Marxism series volume. I'm Michelle Williams. I'm one of the co-editors of this particular volume, and I'm going to chair the event today. Before I get started, I'd like to just welcome both the participants, but also I want to give a special thank you to the panelists for agreeing. You know, we decided to do this on a Sunday afternoon because we've actually experienced in our recent webinars that we've been doing, Sundays seem to be a good time, strangely. I guess people have a bit more time and do attend things. So, but I especially want to thank the panelists for coming because they get co-opted a little bit. The audience chooses, the panelists kind of, we bully them into the Sunday. So thank you very much. So I'm going to begin by giving an overview, which is going to take about 15 minutes. Then Vish will speak about the lessons we've learned from the volume. And then each panelist will give their reflections, which will each have about 10 minutes to give their reflections on the book. If you have any comments or questions, please put them in the chat box, because that way it's easier for us to try to get to as many comments as possible. I just want to give a caveat up front. Because I'm going to be giving a short summary of almost, I think, 10 chapters, I'm going to read, I prepared my input today. And so I'm going to read it both so I can keep to time, but also more importantly, that I don't misconstrue or leave out any important details of my colleagues' chapters. Okay, so this book was a few years in the making. The Democratic Marxism series is a unique series, both in terms of its orientation, but also in terms of its approach. All Democratic Marxism volumes begin with a 2-day workshop in which we present our first drafts. We then revise and resubmit, and then the editors give further feedback, and then we revise and resubmit, and then we go to Wits Press for the blind review process. It's an arduous process, and we really want to thank all the contributors to the volume for their commitment and work, and me personally for keeping to my deadlines, or Wits Press's deadlines as well. But we really want to thank, it's a bigger obligation than most volumes. So thank you very much to the contributors. This process, I think, has actually produced some amazing work, and I think this volume is exceptional in this regard. So the volume was completed in the midst of a world-changing pandemic. What is particularly interesting is that the analyses in the volume are extraordinarily present, anticipating many of the threats to democracy that COVID accentuated. The chapters in this volume all speak to the various threats to democracy and provide a compass as to how we can reclaim and rebuild democracy from within. Part 1 of the volume, titled Neoliberal Capitalism's Destruction of Democracy, begins with an introductory chapter by me that frames the threats to democracy and rising authoritarianism. In this chapter, I trace democracy's ambivalent relationship to capitalism, showing how neoliberal capitalism has generated particular crises for democracy. I argue that democracy requires administrative capacity and state legitimacy, together with principles of equality and liberty. I show that neoliberal capitalism eroded the administrative capacity and state legitimacy. To reclaim democracy, I suggest strong publics with the capacity to articulate public interest, to ensure the states act in their interest, as well as the administrative capacity and legitimacy, and these particular visions of liberty and equality. In the next chapter, chapter 2, Vishwas Satgar homes in on the major threat of neoliberal times, the rise of eco-fascism. Using metabolic rift analysis to show how the metabolizing of fossil fuels provides the basis for the climate crisis, Satgar offers an understanding of how ecological crises are part of the second coming of fascism. The various elements for such a class project are accentuating carbon capitalism, securitizing climate chaos and imperial control, exclusionary nationalism, patriarchy, ecocide, and geoengineering the future. At the same time, Satgar explores the limits of ecofascism and the growing counter-movements, forces, and initiatives around the world, what he calls the 1 degree Celsius movements, such as Extinction Rebellion, Thunberg's Fridays for Future, the US-based Sunrise Movement, and the South African Climate Justice Charter process. After setting the basis for the preceding chapters, In the second part of the volume, Neoliberal Capitalism Against Democracy Globally, the undoing of three paradigmatic democracies, the USA, Brazil, and India, are explored. Turning our gaze to fascism in the US, Linda Gordon explains the long history of the dangers of populism and fascism by tracing the history of the Ku Klux Klan in order to investigate the degrees to which the organization, as well as the US polity, has harbored fascism within the liberal democratic polity. Gordon explains that populism shares many features with fascism. She shows how the original Ku Klux Klan in the southern USA was a terrorist organization that relied on murder and assault and created a fear that coursed through society. By contrast, the Ku Klux Klan in the northern USA formed in the 1920s as an open, respectable, law-abiding, patriotic, evangelical Protestant organization that largely eschewed violence and gained widespread legitimacy, even winning elected positions in Congress. The Northern Klan also did not focus on Blacks, but extended its enemy to include Catholics, Jews, and immigrants. The exclusionary definition of who constitutes the real American, the people, reemerged in Trump's xenophobic and anti-Islamic rhetoric of Make America Great Again. Her analysis also highlights the way in which today's secular populists may discount evidence as fake news. Gordon's chapter reads as a very stark warning to the rising fascist tendencies emerging in South Africa and the world. Inger Solti further focuses our attention on the United States and looks at what right-wing authoritarianism does once in power. Solti shows how Trump's 2016 election victory reflects the crises of representation in the US, which laid the basis for his anti-establishment, his anti-establishment rhetoric, for the basis that his anti-establishment rhetoric to find resonance. Solti argues that while Trump's trade wars have elements of protectionism and represent partial imperial retreat, the main thrust of his economic and foreign policies embody a neo-Reaganite approach to intensifying world market integration, and bilateral transactions are merely the strategy to achieve this. Moving to Brazil, Alfredo Saad Filo provides a chilling account of how neoliberalism resulted in the rise of authoritarianism in Brazil through homing in on Bolsonaro's 2018 presidential election. Saad Filo shows how three primary modalities converged to lay the basis for authoritarian neoliberalism. The first driver was the worldwide rise of the right and the diffusion of neoliberal rationality. As a result, neoliberalism turned economic crises and uncertainty into politically charged spaces of exclusion and polarization. Second, he traces a long history of the left and shows how the Brazilian left's recent decline stemmed from mistakes within the Workers' Party, PT, within their approach to economic development and redistribution, especially in its path of least resistance to macroeconomic dictates. The third driver of the rise of authoritarian neoliberalism, Saad Filo locates in the global rise of authoritarian politics based on a new elite alliance. In Brazil, this elite alliance mobilized against a poorly defined danger of Bolivarianism and the fictional threat of a left-wing authoritarianism led by the PT, the Workers' Party. Taking us to India, Alf Nilsson shows how the right-wing Hindu nationalist BJP 2019 general election victory paved the way for the consolidation of authoritarian populism of Prime Minister Modi. Once considered one of the most democratic and certainly the largest democracy on earth, India's democracy is in free fall. Nilsson locates the rise of the BJP by tracing the history of hegemonic projects that have prevailed in India over the last 15 years. He shows how the Congress Party and its ruling alliance adopted market-based economic policies that combined with rights-based legislation and enshrined new civil liberties and socioeconomic entitlements. But Nilsson argues that Modi's success is not a departure from neoliberalism, but fuses market-based development with a coercive majoritarianism that resonates across caste and class divides among the country's Hindu majority. The three international cases highlight neoliberalism's destructive role in democratic polities. We then turn to part 3 of the book, Neoliberal Capitalism Against Democracy in South Africa. This section begins with a chapter by Devin Pillay, who shows the important democratizing role of the labor movement, but also the very same labor movement helped bring in the power Jacob Zuma and his close allies, including the kleptocratic bourgeoisie and Julius Malema's ANC Youth League and later the Economic Freedom Fighters. Pillay shows how the Zuma faction in the ANC and the EFF threaten South Africa's constitutional order and democracy. Pillay argues the tragedy is that the organized left, in particular the trade union movement today, stands transfixed as deers caught in the headlights, while right-wing nationalist populists steal aspects of their discourse to ride the wave of discontent. Pillay suggests that an alternative is being articulated by social movements, NGOs, and a small number of trade unions who are arguing for reining in the fossil fuel economy. Moving from the contending political forces vying for power, we turn to an investigation of information and media. Dale McKinley looks at the post-apartheid South Africa's reluctant commitment to the right to information, popularly referred to as the right to know, a fundamental democratic right. He argues that by locating the right to access to information within the state security and intelligence apparatus, the state has curtailed democracy itself by hobbling informed popular participation and citizen voice to engage and challenge the state. In this way, the secrecy that characterized the apartheid state continues in the practices and mindsets of the post-apartheid era, creating an ambivalent relationship between the state and the people. While the right to information is enshrined in the Constitution, it has been generally viewed as a secondary right. As a result, the state does not prioritize transparency, information sharing, and accountability. McKinley reminds us of the paramount importance of access to information for a robust and expansive democracy, as the commoning of and public access to information is the lifeblood of any meaningful participatory democracy. Mandla Radebe situates his analysis of the media within the central democratizing role media plays as the fourth estate, but he shows how ownership patterns of media houses threaten to undermine this role. Radebe historicizes his analysis by pointing out that some sections of the media played a significant role in the struggle for democracy. And while the post-apartheid constitution enshrines media freedom, these advances are limited by the way in which media has been configured along concentrated ownership patterns. He shows how the ownership patterns and control of media has produced excellent journalism, an effective watchdog role that exposes malfeasance, but commercialization has narrowed the democratic space for subalterns through the demise of left-leaning alternative media. Ultimately, Radebe argues that the media bears important continuities with the authoritarianism of apartheid, and there is a need for accessible, decommodified alternative media with a public character. Reading Radebe and McKinley's chapters provide a powerful analysis of the threats to democracy found in the state's control of information and the private sector's control of the media. While social media is ostensibly open to multiple sources of news, it still concentrates control in corporate hands and presents other threats in terms of misinformation, opinions, rather than fact-based news, and sensationalization. And we're feeling very much the effects of this right now in South Africa. Moving from media and information, Jane Duncan looks at the enemy within as she shows the increasing trend towards securitizing protests in response to rising levels of anti-austerity unrest. With explosively high levels of unemployment and poverty, the state has opted for a law and order approach rather than democratizing society, dismantling inequality, and ensuring security of existence. Duncan shows that the changes in social control, namely the turn to greater securitization, threatens democracy. By focusing on protest waves since 2015, she shows how the state identifies domestic instability as a major security threat, which laid the basis for the state to justify anti-democratic practices of invasive surveillance and securitization. Reflecting the depth of neoliberal rationality, these practices are not seen as undermining fundamental democratic rights, but rather are framed as a good state protecting the nation. Moving from the threats to democracy, the final chapter of the book, well, there's a concluding chapter as well that Vish writes, but the final substantive chapter of the book is Gunnar Kaff, who turns our attention to finding spaces for left renewal in the crisis-ridden times. Kaff argues that building a renewed left project requires both the ability to imagine a different future and ideas about how to concretely realize the vision. He provides a critique of the current political parties, including the ANC state, and argues for the need to envision a future outside of the current parties. He locates renewal in mass movements that are not afraid to think beyond our current realities, to envision both realistic but also radical possibilities. Avoiding blueprints requires thinking, debating, and experimenting with possibilities that do not simply hark back to bygone eras of imagined better times. Kaff offers an important reflection on the possible ways to rebuild a left project that builds a better, more just, and more egalitarian future. The chapters collectively and individually raise important warnings about the ways in which neoliberal capitalism erodes democracy and enables its capture by corrupt authoritarian forces. Neoliberal capitalism is destroying democracy, and democratic forces are facing a difficult world, but the future has not yet been written, and there are immense opportunities that are explored in this book. So with this overview of the book, I'm now going to turn over to Vish, who will speak to the conclusion and what we've learned out of the book, and then we will go to the reflections of our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle, and good afternoon to everybody, our panelists and all attendees. Thank you for making the time to be here. The Democratic Marxism series is premised on a commitment to taking democracy seriously. Now, this is unusual, I suppose, for those who look at and perceive what is considered the Marxist left. This series and this project, this intellectual project, is really about recognizing that democracy and its inheritance doesn't belong to liberalism or to capitalism. Actually, democracy grew up alongside capitalism, was in contradiction with it, was in tension with it, and is constantly being tamed by capitalism. So the contemporary form of neoliberal capitalism has advanced a particular form of democracy, a market democracy. And many of the chapters basically reflect on this and unpack it and its consequences in, if you like, the vanguard of liberal democracy in the USA, in the largest democracy in the world, India, the largest democracy in Latin America, Brazil, and of course, the most promising democracy in Africa, in South Africa. And what comes through is that the sovereignty of capital that has been constitutionalized and entrenched in these markets democracies are having debilitating consequences. The demos is actually undermined. The people are undermined. The democratic rights, institutions, proceduralism, and contestation of these societies are undermined. I think the second very important point to make coming out of this volume is that the term fascism is used very loosely in our discourse. It's used as an appellation, as an analytical category and catch-all phrase for what is considered the new right and what is considered an authoritarian politics on the march. Now, what we try to do in this volume is unsettle a bit of this. There's a conflation going on between interwar 20th century fascism and the new right and the new fascism that's on the march. And this is thinking that you'd find generally within kind of liberal political science. There's a checklist of, you know, the big man and of course, violence and so on and so on. And that adds up now to fascism. What we do in this volume is really go beyond that. And now political sociology generally guides us in how to think about authoritarianism and fascism. For political sociologists, authoritarianism generally emerges when there are rivalries and contradictions amongst ruling elites and ruling classes. and fascism emerges from below. Now, while we have this in the background to our thinking, we felt that it was also not adequate methodologically for us to think about what is new about the new right today. And so in this volume, we attempt to methodologically kind of grapple with this new right. And there's three important emphases. The first is to recognize that capitalism historically has had deep general crisis moments like the interwar years. And within those crisis moments, there is always a fascist tendency that comes to the fore. But we have to understand that fascist tendency in context. The world right now is going through the fourth great crisis of capitalism. And it wasn't just the financial crisis, it's the convergence of climate breakdown and so on. In that context, we also analytically have to be very precise about what kind of tendency is fascism taking today? What is its face? What is its dynamics and so on? I think the second important sort of methodological emphasis is to understand the histories of the right wing. Very, very important. Because if you look at the new nativist nationalisms, say in the United States, there's an antecedent here. And Linda Gordon's chapter is very, very important. In the global South in the 20th century, particularly after World War II, you had several military dictatorships that come to the fore. The political science literature generally classified this in the sociology literature as authoritarian regimes. But were these really authoritarian regimes in the global South, or were they actually forms of fascism? But these histories are informing the present. So Bolsonaro, who comes out of the military, has basically mainstreamed the military even in his cabinet, for example. And that history looms large in the kind of contemporary politics in Brazil. I think the third methodological issue is to really look closely at the nature of the class projects coming to the fore. And how is the right engaging with capitalism, the institutions of capitalism, and ultimately doing a political economy analysis of these class projects. In my own chapter, I basically argue that we have various forces that are on the political stage that are refusing to break with carbon capitalism. And because they're refusing to break with carbon capitalism, I mean, whether it's Trump or Biden, by the way, in my view, they are reproducing an eco-fascist project that is leading to our annihilation and extermination. And so these three methodological emphases are very, very important for how we're thinking about contemporary authoritarianism and in some instances, fascism. The third important point I want to make is that most of the chapters allude also to failures of the left. The funny thing is that, you know, in the interwar years in the 20th century, the big bogey of the right was the left. Powerful trade unions, social democratic parties, communist parties, socialist parties, and so on. You do not have that bogey anymore. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and so on, everything was given on the plate, you know, to the hegemonic US and to the centers of capital. The left is very, very weak across the planet. But where we've seen attempts to reclaim ground, whether it's the PT in Brazil, once upon a time, the ANC in South Africa, and so on, there's a need for deep reflection of how these projects lost their way. And this volume alludes to this important challenge. In South Africa, we recently experienced the violence. And I mean, what loomed large in all of this was a completely failed state that could not protect communities, could not affirm our constitutional rights, and so on. And so we are in a situation where, you know, the flames of race hatred and so on are being stimulated and encouraged. And so depolarizations coming to the fore. And racism's coming to the fore. The other point about the book is that it problematized identity politics and how it's married to exclusionary nationalism. And this is very, very important because even in the academy today, identity politics looms large. It's taught in curriculums, in classrooms, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that's not to say that identities are unimportant. They are very, very important. But identity politics in the real world has also had problems, particularly when it rejects subaltern and radical universals that can build solidarities, positive solidarities. And in that context, it's also given rise and informed exclusionary nationalisms, white nationalisms, Black nationalisms. The EFF is a very, very good example, homegrown example of an exclusionary nationalist organization. Religious fundamentalism, also very, very important today in the world, and has a very, very important place in exclusionary nationalisms. Charismatic Christianity in Trump's America, and still there, very much alive now. In Bolsonaro's Brazil, Hindu fundamentalism in India, Zionism, Islamic fundamentalism. All these fundamentalisms are also about affirming particularist identities. And these are extremely dangerous, which this volume highlights as part of the challenge and the problem. But ultimately, the volume ends on the note that it's important to defend democracy by and for the people. The democratic project is never finished. It never fully arrives. And therefore, it's an ongoing journey for us all. And so the volume ends on the note that there are movements on the horizon, advancing a new deeply democratic politics. There's a need for a new post-neoliberal imagination to rethink parties and ultimately to rethink leadership and the ruled in a progressive way that deepens democracy. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Vish, that's wonderful. Okay, so now we will get to our panelists. And we're not sure what's happened to Mazibuko because he confirmed yesterday. So I hope everything is okay with him, or maybe he'll show up a bit late. He was going to be the second speaker, so we still have some time. The first speaker, our first panelist today is Judith February, and I'm really, really delighted that she has agreed to do this. Judith is a lawyer, governance specialist, and columnist. She is a visiting fellow at the Wits School of Governance. Prior to that, she was executive director of the HSRC's Democracy and Governance Unit and lead of the IDASA South African Governance Program for 9 years. She's a trustee of the Nelson Mandela Foundation and author of Turning and Turning, Exploring the Complexities of South Africa's Democracy. So she's the perfect respondent today. Her legal newsletter, Judith's Prudence, which I really love, appears fortnightly in the Daily Maverick. Okay, Judith, I'll hand it over to you. And since Mazibuko's not here, I'll give you, I won't even tell you until it's about 12, 13 minutes.
That's great. Thank you, Michelle. You should never tell a lawyer that they can carry on speaking. But thank you very much for that introduction. And it's really great to be a part of this panel. A lot has been said between you and Vish about the overarching chapters of the book. So I'm going to just take 2 or 3 points that sort of stood out for me, and particularly given the kind of political moment that South Africa's in. But I found the book a fascinating read and a really worthwhile addition to all the writings that there are at the moment on democracy and development, but particularly the global perspective. Because I think there is a tendency in South Africa to always think that everything's only happening to us, and that nowhere else in the world are these things happening around inequality, around climate change, around poverty and unemployment, etc. But here we are. In the wake of a rather rough, I would say, 8 months in post-apartheid, 8 weeks in our post-apartheid democracy. So I found the themes of the book with looking at the lurch to authoritarianism, and I thought particularly the examples of the US, Brazil, and India and their undoing, the exploration of that particularly apposite. And then the chapter, I suppose, because it feeds into my sort of commitment to institution building and understanding of our constitutional democracy, this idea of the chapter by you, Michelle, on democracy and how to reclaim it, but that the requirements of that are administrative capacity, state legitimacy, together with equality and liberty, and of course arguing that neoliberal capitalism has eroded both. And so I found the book a very helpful exploration of the privatization of the common good. And so then the question is how we reclaim democracy. And the book takes us on this journey, as we've heard described. And a journey that for me, as somebody who follows institutions, is about invoking also this constitutional framework that we have of the founding provisions of the Constitution, accountability and transparency, but also the thread which runs through our Constitution of participation. But we need to give that meaning and that life in different contexts, and specifically where we are at the moment. And I think the final chapter is a very good segue to building of mass movements. And so, while the book, of course, as has been said, doesn't directly address this COVID-19 pandemic that we're in, but as you said, Michelle, it was prescient in so many ways, because this pandemic really has laid bare so many things: the fragility of human life at the very basic level, of economies, and also the systems that underpin it. But it's laid bare also our deep inequalities, our prejudices, and of course, in a society like South Africa, our institutions already hollowed out and then unable at a moment of crisis to really deal with a health pandemic and everything that goes along with it. So this unbearable strain has been placed on every sinew of our society. And I think in the Jane Duncan chapter, and Jane's written so much about protest and securitization, we see this exacerbation of the violence of poverty and those on the margins of our society, but also the violence of the state. And there has been for a long time this careless disregard of rights, of people's civil and political rights and socioeconomic rights, with little to no accountability for those breaches. Collins Corsa dies in his own backyard. And so if we add to all of this, the violence and the moment that we're in post-July, and how we make sense of all the multiple factors that contributed to those awful days. And one wants to call it an insurrection, but there's power in words have power. And so, once you call it something, there's also a concomitant responsibility to do something about it. And I'm not sure that we've had enough sense made of what's happened in July to label it. So I call it the violence that racked our country. But I think, and that's, to me, makes this book particularly welcome at this point, because it makes sense of where South Africa is. It tries to make sense of it, and it fits very well with what we experienced in July, but also it takes place within a context where we've had a weak state, which has been eroded in various ways, and I'll come to that in a minute. And also that the imperfections of our own transition to democracy, and that was itself a result of compromise and a result of geopolitical forces. And we seem to be at a similar moment right now. The point I want to make is around the regulation of corporations and of those exercising power in that respect. And particularly as regards the backdrop that we have of this very weak and hollowed out state. And what we saw in July was truly that we are on our own. And if we wanted no better graphic example, it was those days in July, that there are either those in power who would sit back and let it burn, and who simply don't care, or those who are simply too weak to do anything about it. But what we've seen in South Africa is a state which is complicit in paving the way for rogue corporations and private interests to undermine democracy and development. And we've seen it in multiple ways, but probably the most graphic way has been the state capture project, which has created, I would argue, one of the greatest crises for our democracy. And there are various chapters in the book mention corruption in different forms, in different ways. It has also led to the violence we saw in July. And it is this obviously unhealthy and corrupt congealing of the private and the public, which creates this collusion between the interests of capital and the interests of a corrupt class of politicians. And this has resulted in certain policy decisions, but also in certain ways in which policy simply wasn't made, in which there are just lacunae in terms of policy, in terms of laws. And then, of course, again, the point about the weak state with no administrative capacity entirely hollowed out makes for a perfect storm, whether you're exercising power with regard, looking at regulation of corporations, but also state accountability. So we think of Marikana, for example. And so there has to, the book, I think, helpfully takes us to the way in which we can create mass movements, movements from below, to create greater accountability, but also to protect and defend the rights that there are in the Constitution. But it squares quite interestingly, I think, with this idea of with the notion of the degradation of the environment. And what the recent example that was in the news this week with relating to the United Phosphorus Limited, UPL, who owned a warehouse in Durban. You might have read about this. And it seems as if this company has simply sidestepped every single regulatory defense. Their environmental hazards, health hazards. It is a warehouse full of hazardous chemicals. And what happened during the violence was that this warehouse was set alight. Firefighters who went in didn't actually realize that they were going into a factory and a warehouse which had all this these hazardous chemicals and waste inside it. There was a secrecy around what was inside the warehouse. Only investigative journalists managed to find out and to publish that information. But it's had a knock-on effect in rivers, to the residents, wetlands, beaches, ever since the 12th of July and ever since that fire. And so that seems to me to be a perfect example of corporate power, which has been exercised in the most egregious way, of breaches of regulation and governments simply missing in action. Who is going to take responsibility? Who allowed that warehouse to be put up next door to a shopping mall and across this road from a school? And so these are the kinds of questions. This is where the private and public interest, that collusion happens, and it undermines and erodes rights. And I remember writing a piece in 2013 about the collapse of the Tongaat Mall. And I went to look up and read up about what actually happened, because in South Africa, we move on very quickly, unfortunately. And 2 men died in that collapse of that building owned by a private individual. And he subsequently sold it. The NPA has a file. There was an inquiry. But what the workers said is, we've lost faith in the system after it's failed us. Too many promises have been made. Some of us who are not here have lost limbs and suffered excruciating pain. And so it seems as if whatever movements we're building from below is that holding those to account who are in power, whether they're exercising state power or private corporations, that needs to be top of mind in terms of that collusion of interests. And of course, we saw in state capture, as I've said before, the most egregious collusion between capital and those in power. And it takes, I think it moves very well into Dale McKinley's chapter on the right to information. And I know Dale's done some just sterling work with the Right to Know campaign. And so a lot of the examples, and also it's a lived experience of how transparency, accountability, and information sharing needs to be prioritized. And so for me, it strikes me that the Constitution and this broad architecture needs flesh to its bones, but we also need a re-examination of the values and the democratic behavior that we want in a society. I mean, there's the book on how democracies die. It is about the kinds of institutions you build, but those are populated by individuals. And of course, there has to be a demand for accountability. And so the examples of the social movements are instructive, and we've seen those in South Africa, whether it's the treatment action campaign, which was mentioned in the chapter, but also, for example, equal education, the Right to Know campaign in a different way. But certainly the treatment action campaign is used here. And the reminder that we need to think outside of political parties. And if we saw again, if July taught us anything, was that our traditional political parties are either cannibalizing themselves, like the ANC is, or simply weak, lost focus, and or corrupt. we can't discount their power because it is the form of representative democracy that we have, and necessary but not sufficient. But we need this power from below, as is described. And so I'd just like to make a last point, which is attributable to some of the work that Vern Harris and others have done, others have done at the Mandela Foundation, which is about a call for a renewed democracy and a new social imaginary. And in this paper, they argue for, they look at Judith Butler's, what she terms a social philosophy of living and sustainable bonds. And it strikes me that it fits quite nicely with what we've been talking about today and what this book talks about, that this rampant individualism, and which is the hallmark of neoliberalism, has caused lives and livelihoods to be lost, swathes of humanity discarded, environmental degradation. So how do we go from a society, and I think the book tries to address this, which puts livability before existence, sustaining, replacing, extracting, and discarding, provisioning before growth, sharing before accumulation, care before competition. And how do we move then to what she calls common bonds of social bonds, common bonds of interdependency? In Butler's work, she talks about it as the remaking democracy and society from the bottom up as well, but talking about it as not being only about human lives, but other sensate creatures, the environment and infrastructures. We depend on them, they depend on us, in turn to sustain a livable world. So the question is, and I think this book argues for it in mass movements, but there's also the micro level that we're arguing for from the bottom up, and that calls for renewed social bonds of interdependency amongst people in different ways. And Harry Boyd argues for this with regard to his work on citizen action and communities of work, for example, but that it underlying all of it is a notion of open democracy and also of radical transparency. But the last point I want to make is, what I found particularly interesting was when talking about this left renewal as protest and developmental work. And I particularly liked that focus because the developmental work included art, culture, poetry, and heritage. And so that we move towards a social transformation which is meaningful. Arts and culture, I think, of themselves in our democratic society being commodified and or neglected, sidelined. We've been seen as citizens, have been seen as one-dimensional human beings. Government speaks at citizens in a technocratic language. Their dreaming and imagining is not part of this world. And the arts is a casualty of this language and this mindset. And so I found the book interesting for those reasons, and also the points around the decommodification of the media. But I'll end there, and just to say that while the book deals with a difficult subject, and it deals with, particularly at the time where we're in South Africa, but also we are around the world, the strain towards authoritarianism. This past week, we saw the fall of Kabul. The world seems to be in a very precarious position. But the book attempts, I think, to deal with all of this complexity, but not without hope for the moment that we're in, and that the struggle for a sustainable and livable world is the work of democracy. And I think it provides a very useful touchstone for those of us who work in the area of democracy, institution building, and rights. Thanks, Michelle.
Wonderful, Judith. Thank you very much. And I'm delighted that you're going to be doing the Daily Maverick piece as well, though, with 1,000, because it's great to get these reflections. Thank you. That was fantastic. Really wonderful. Okay, so Mazibuko hasn't shown up, and we've tried to contact him. He's not answering, so it looks like, I don't know what's happened to him. I hope he's okay, but that's okay, because it's giving us more time to allow Judith to go a bit longer, and Richard, I'll give you the same amount of time as well. Okay, so our next speaker, our next panelist is Richard Calland, and he's a constitutional lawyer. It's funny, we have two lawyers. Constitutional lawyer and political commentator. He's based at the University of Cape Town, where he is an associate professor in public law. And Calland's legal specialization is the right to access to information and transparency law and policy. In addition, he works extensively on the political economy of sustainable development as a fellow of the University of Cambridge's Institute of Sustainability Leadership. In 2020, he co-led an expert group commissioned by the UN Secretary General to report on the state of international climate finance. Okay, Richard, so you'll have up to 15 minutes as well. And if you go over, I'll interrupt you then. Thanks, Richard. So lovely to have you here as well. Thank you.
Oh, Michelle, thank you very much indeed to you and to Vish and to the other organizers for inviting me. It's a real privilege to be part of this conversation on a Sunday afternoon. So congratulations on the book and the series. I think it would be appropriate also to note and thank the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung Foundation, who I know are behind this. I'm sure Jan Ledeker, its former head of its office in South Africa, was, I'm sure, a very eager, keen, and enthusiastic supporter of this project. And I'm a huge fan of Jan and his innovative intellectual approach to life. So I just wanted to mention that. So really, you've set us an extraordinarily difficult task to try and respond to such a rich and deep book in just 10 minutes, even if that's extended by 2 or 3 more minutes. So I'm going to try and limit myself, hopefully wisely, to just making 2 or 3 points. And the first point, well, the first thing to say is that it is a book that poses and attempts to grapple with and even answer some very, very hard and difficult questions, not just of our particular age, but of the age. And I think in that sense, it's a very ambitious book, and I commend that ambition. And certainly reading it, it made me think a lot harder and a lot deeper about some of the big questions that face us. In terms of really, as I see it, political philosophy and our attitude to democracy, contested as it is, and in particular, I think the relationship between democracy and the current form of capitalism that we have to contend with. So my 3 points are really, one, firstly about context, and secondly, something about what that context suggests in terms of what history tells us might come next. And thirdly, some sort of concluding observations or points related to what I took away from the book. And all 3 points are in the frame of the contributions made by the chapters of the book. So firstly, the context, the global one. It's clear that life on Earth, human life on Earth, I should say, faces an unprecedented, perhaps, level or set of global system level shocks and crises. The first, of course, is the climate emergency. The second is economics. It's the socioeconomic inequality that is the underlying, I would suggest, cause of so much of the precarity and instability that we face. The public health crisis, of course, that COVID-19 has introduced, but which reveals the material disadvantages and severe challenges that the majority of people face within that context of a very divided and unequal and unjust society. And thirdly, decades, if not centuries, of racial injustice. So these multiple layers of crisis points, and I think the most extreme, in my view, would be the climate emergency, but in many ways, it's the way in which they all relate. And I think the book does a very good job at showing how they interrelate. And indeed, I suspect that I'm speaking to a converted audience here on the point I'm about to make, but let me make it for the record nonetheless, which is that recognizing the severity of the climate emergency and appreciating the existential crisis that it creates for humanity is now a fundamentally progressive political undertaking. And there was a time, even as recently as 10 years ago, where people in progressive politics would say, and this is a crude kind of summary of it, but they would say, well, I'm too red to be green. And now I think one switches that around and says, well, one should say, I'm too red not to be green. And of course, what green is has gone through, I think, a very swift evolution in the last 20 years. So green politics now is not about the environment per se, because the environmental degradation that we face is a symptom and an effect. It's not a cause. And people who think hard about this problem, as this book does, recognize that the causes are essentially economic. It's about the choices that we make about economic resources, and therefore they are political, because the political choices we make about the economy determine the outcomes. And so this notion that, of course, Vish has really, I think, owned or sought to stamp into our consciousness of eco-fascism is, I think, a very powerful notion, and one that we need to take seriously. And of course, it's the overlap and the alignment between the abuse of natural capital and the abuse of human capital, which I think brings left-wing socialist and progressive politics together with a recognition of the dangers of carbon capitalism and the need to take very, very serious and now increasingly urgent action if we are not to face a climate breakdown of such magnitude that even by the end of the century, life on Earth will have become extremely difficult. So that's my starting point. Now, arising from that, let me immediately confess to one of the challenges I have in grappling with these issues, which may be a reflection of my limitations rather than certainly not. This is certainly not meant as a criticism of the book. But one of the things that I find so confusing, and maybe it's just an inherent contradiction in this kind of analytical frame, is that in many ways the neoliberal capitalist order that we I think recognize as being in many ways the core cause of so many of the levels of crisis that we face, has emerged during a period in which also there has been a really profound, I would argue, project that some people might call liberal, around the international rule of law, around recognition of human rights, around the building of multilateral institutions, and so on. So many of the things that the book suggests are under threat, whether it's constitutionalism, or rule of law, human rights, the right to information in Dale McKinley's chapter, and so on. In many ways, these are liberal rights. These are protections to society and to individuals and to communities, which have, in some respects, and perhaps largely even, I would argue, a liberal genesis. So I think that tension there, or that contradiction, paradox, whatever it may be, between kind of the liberalist or liberal dimension to politics and the apparent companionship it has with the rise of neoliberal markets or neoliberal politics and governance over the last 20, 30, even 40 or more years, I find at times very confusing, and I find it very difficult at times to untangle those different strands. This book grapples, I think, very, very substantially and seriously with those entanglements. And I found it very helpful to help me think through that untangling process. But nor does it arrive at what I would perhaps call definitive answers in terms of where this takes us and what this means for what should happen next. So turning to, secondly, what should happen next and learning from history. I think it's absolutely right, as Vish's chapter points out, that the pandemic that followed World War I was followed by a failure to recognize that the underlying structural fault lines of the global economy had not been taken care of during the 20s. The roaring 20s followed the pandemic. May well something will happen similar to that now. And that led, because the structural problems were not dealt with, it led, of course, to the 1928 crash, which led inevitably, inexorably to the rise of fascism in the 30s. And what keeps me awake at night is that trend, that pattern of history, we may well be sleepwalking into precisely that same sequence of events with new variations and particularities, but a very similar pattern, that progress towards a fascist outcome or fascist dominance is very much one of the future scenarios that we face, unless we take very great care and take action to challenge that. So that concerns me, and it's reflected, I think, in Linda Gordon's very interesting chapter about the rise of fascism in the United States, which I found extremely interesting and educational. CAFS, if I'm pronouncing the final chapter correctly, CAFS offers the idea that there are three kind of scenarios going forward. One is that we will get stuck in a kind of impasse, that the Gramscian trauma of being stuck between the past and the future without being able to define the future, that kind of paralyzing impasse may be one scenario, kind of carrying on as we are, the proverbial frog boiling in the water. The second option that CAF suggests is that the rise of authoritarian populism will take real hold. And that's the kind of repeat of the 30s model, which, if I was a betting man, which I am, I would put money on, frankly, at the moment, for reasons I'll come to, which is the failure to really articulate a powerful political project to oppose it. And the third is that, I suppose, what CAF is suggesting would be that progressive political project, which is one of radical social transformation. It occurs to me that there may be a fourth option, which is that whether we like it or not, we will end up with a social transformation, a radical one, which will emerge out of all of these scenarios, but certainly the impasse one. If we do nothing, then within 100 years, then life as we know it on Earth will in any case be taken care of by the climate breakdown. And that will have such devastating effect on our ability to live what we now regard as normal lives on planet Earth, that all these other questions will become largely immaterial. And so so I suppose then, lastly, to turn into some sort of attempt to pull this together into some concluding takeaway observations from my side. Where does that leave us then? What is the political project that would be powerful enough to combat what is the very, very strong vision and strong political project of the right, of the new right, which is, as is often the case with such projects, aided and abetted by its refusal to engage with complexity. In fact, as a short and simple definition of populism, I find no better one than the former editor of The Guardian, Alan Rusbridger, who in a book on the media a couple of years ago said that populism is the denial of complexity. And of course, what those of us who claim to be on the left or progressive politically, what we always do is engage with that complexity, and we grapple strongly with these complex issues. And at times that has a paralyzing effect. It leads to a political inertia, it leads to division, dissent, and it fails to articulate a strong vision that can be sold politically. So, and as Devon Pillay in his really excellent chapter, interesting chapter, says that in many ways this is a failure of the organized left, and that what we should be looking for is not a new political party or a new entrance to the world of representative democracy, because it's representative democracy that is failing us, that we have to look for something else. Now, the main message of the book seems to be that we need to democratize democracy, and we need to do so from below. And that is, of course, a compelling idea. The question is, how will that form of revolution be organized? Because if one wanted to search for yet another scenario for the way forward, it would be that an unorganized revolution, sort of the kind that emerged in July in South Africa, emerges, one of anarchy, of violence, of destruction, not of democracy, not of respect for human rights, not peaceful in any way or even progressive, but one that is fundamentally violent and full of criminality, and which has a burnt, scorched earth attitude because people have lost all hope. And that may then be another rather apocalyptic kind of scenario that we have to contend with. But where the book sort of comes to, and I find this analytically persuasive, is that for this democratization of democracy from below, we need to forget about representative democracy. We need to build participatory democracy of a far more radical and different kind. And it seems to me that part of that is about developing different nodes of decision-making, which one might call multi-stakeholder. And on that point, let me end with a point or a question, which some may find controversial, I don't know, but which I would welcome thoughts on, which is the role of the for-profit sector. Let me call it that, the for-profit sector. Because, and this may be influenced by the fact that, and I willingly disclose this, I get paid by some corporates, I advise some corporates, I work with corporates closely to strengthen their ability to understand political economy, to be good corporate, intelligent corporate citizens, and indeed to renovate their own approaches to sustainability and to put sustainability at the heart of their business strategies, the heart of their businesses. And whether that is in any way Trotskyite in its attempt to influence from within, or whether it's simply a reflection of a very moderate form of progressive politics at best, is for others to judge. But what I see there often, not always, but often, is a much more serious willingness to engage with these difficult issues, often than one finds in government. And moreover, with the power and ability to get things done and to act. And of course, that doesn't change the system. These are molecules within a bigger ecosystem, which we are in this conversation calling neoliberal capitalism. And I recognize that. But what I'm suggesting is that one should not fall into the Corbyn trap of treating corporates as always evil, always bad, always malign. We should instead engage with them. They are part of society. And unless we are willing to move to a new society in which there is no for-profit sector, in which capitalism is overthrown, which doesn't seem to be what this book is suggesting. Rather, this book is suggesting we should take the Marxist idea of taking the best from capitalism and integrating it into a different vision for society. Well, that new vision for society, unlike after the Second World War, has not yet emerged. This book is a contribution towards helping us think through the choices and the inherent intellectual and philosophical challenges we face, and to help us formulate some kind of political project, which, as I think it was Cuff again argues, has a visionary aspect, but also a political strategy to achieve it. In other words, Corbynism, but with a way of winning and taking power. So on that note, I conclude, and thank you very much again for the opportunity to speak at this, and I look forward to other contributions from the audience. Thank you very much, Michelle.
Thanks, Richard. Wonderful. That was great. And you did throw up, I mean, because I'm sharing, I won't respond, but the thing about the liberal rights, I think Vish might respond later, or also the role of the profit sector. I think these are great questions. So far in the chat, I haven't seen any questions. Just congratulatory thanks and to the speakers and everybody. Okay, there is one now. I'll look at it. But I also wanted to just announce this book, as well as all of the Democratic Marxism series, are online. They're open access online. And when I give my thanks at the end, I'll reiterate that. But that's a big thanks to Vish in particular foundation funders who have helped make that happen. Okay. So the increasing, I'm going to just read a comment here. The increasing securitization by the state creates conditions in which mass movements are subdued. Despite so many, sorry, oh God, sorry, I'm not very good at keeping, okay. Despite so many protests and the July unrest, we see, sorry, I'm not good at getting my thing. Vish, can you read this? Oh, we see so little movement towards democracy. What form should social protests take to have an effect on government? For example, a universal basic income grant seems to offer the best hope for many of our, I think this is just a comment. Okay, my cursor keeps going crazy. I'm sorry about this. Okay, the basic income grant seems to offer the best hope for many of our impoverished people, but we have made little progress. So I think that's just a comment, or maybe it is a question about what form should protests take. And then there's another question about how can the middle class particularly be engaged in social protests. So I don't know if there are we're welcoming any comments, questions. As I said, please put your hands in put your comments in the chat group. group because we're very limited on time. And if there is any time at the end, I'm going to open it, ask any of the actual speakers would like to say anything. But oh, I see Dale is actually, he's one of the authors. So I'll let Dale speak. But otherwise, please put your, if you have a question, please put it in the chat line. Okay, Dale, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm thanks, Michelle. I'm unmuted.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly engage Richard in relation to the point he made in relation to the liberal versus the sort of more radical origins, particularly in relation to access to information, because in my understanding and what I was trying to do was to say that actually it's through the people's struggles and through the radical participatory democracy that was predated even capitalist societies and liberal rights, in which access to information became fundamental to people's power to actually to do things democratically. And so what we found was that actually access to information and participatory democracy were one and the same kind of things. And what happened in the context of liberal was they took that and understandably made some laws, some covenants and other things and called it right to know and whatever as the semantics we used. But to say that this is a result of a people's struggle and a people's history that is not necessary, that was against the commodification of information and the commodification of that. And I think that was where we must understand that. So maybe that would just help in your conundrum with the liberal versus the more radical. That's all. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Dale. So as I said, the only people who are gonna, just because we have time, we don't wanna, but if you please put your comments. There was another comment about the role, not just the middle class, but also the care economy, like a feminist lens. And I don't know if anyone has anything they'd like to say about that, any of the speakers, or are there other comments? I don't think so. Yeah, so I don't know, Vish, do you want to respond? Dale responded, I think, well to the liberal point, but do you want to also say anything about that or the private sector?
Yeah, sure. Just to say on the care economy, I think it's very important. And hence the next volume in the Democratic Marxism series is on the crisis of social reproduction. It's on feminism and emancipatory feminism. And people like Samantha Hargreaves and many others here today have contributed to that volume. And it's a very crucial issue for building from below, strengthening the roots of democracy. I think the point about liberalism and democracy, I think there's room for us to kind of maybe disagree on the history of democracy. Because where I'm coming from and the way we've positioned the Democratic Marxism series, it's about 500 years of people's struggles to win freedoms in the transition from feudalism to capitalism, from the transition from colonialism to decolonial societies and so on. There've been major struggles all along the way. And those struggles have given us rights and freedoms and institutions and so on and so on. And that struggle continues. And so, maybe it's a question of political language. Maybe we tend to conflate all these rights and freedoms to liberalism in political philosophy, maybe even in the academy and so on. But I think it's important to separate these things out. There are left positions, discourses, and approaches to democracy, which is what the DM volume series is all about, keeping that alive. More democracy, not less. The question of corporates, I think it's a very important question. We cannot duck this issue. Capital is there, it looms large. But I do think that in how we reimagine social contracts going forward, kind of the next big leap for our societies from this crisis, capital has to show its commitment to, I would argue, a more progressive social order. It's interesting, if you look at Bernie Sanders' intervention during the elections, he was all about renewing American democracy for the 99%. His Green New Deal was recognizing that the stick was bent too far towards capital. And so, it'll be interesting to see if we have capitalists that step up and say, listen, inequality is really bad in society and we need to be taxed more. We need inheritance taxes. We need wealth taxes. We need to make sure that on climate, we pushed hard, etc., etc. Ironically, in South Africa, that hasn't happened for over 20 years of democracy. Most capitalists in South Africa believe they pay their taxes, although there's lots of loopholes. They push illicit funds offshore, etc., and their job is done to our society. So I think there's a challenge there for politics, for the renewal of a social contract that deepens democracy and brings in capital on the terms of the people. Thanks.
All right, wonderful. I'm not sure if Richard or Judith want to say anything at this point. There are a few more points. I'll just raise these and then I'll open it up to Richard and Judith as well. The question is just about whether state-owned enterprises can play a role in strengthening our democracy, as well as how do we hold corporates accountable? And I think Judith raised this. I mean, especially when you have a situation like we have with state capture, and I mean the hollowing out of state regulatory authorities all over. How do you hold corporates accountable? And I hear Richard's point as well, is that there are some corporates who actually want to play a kind of developmental role and be very much part of this kind of new future that we need to build. But you know, I would also want you to push you a little harder on thinking about that, Richard, in terms of, you know, they can't bring democracy, they can support democratic projects, especially when you talk about, you know, you agree that the role of participatory democracy and I mean, I think representative democracy continues to be important, but corporates, you know, have a role to play, but they can't bring it. So maybe they can be, but we have to, you know, I mean, as Andla Khadebei's chapter tells us, you know, control of media, we have to always be, they have to be within strict regulatory bodies. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. And then there's a question or a comment about the 12% contribution by workers. Well, you know, what does this mean for democracy? Would this enhance or would this hinder democracy? So I'm going to give both of you guys time to respond, any reflections, and then I think I'm going to close. That'll be the towards the end, and then I'll just give some concluding thanks. Okay.
So Michelle, so if I can just come in here. So just on the point of corporates, I mean, this is something that I've also been thinking about. So also disclosure, I mean, I sit on the board of a listed company and we had a strategic planning last week, and you know, 90% of it was about sustainability. 90% of it was talking about ESG, was talking about climate change, about divesting in coal, and so on. So so very interesting, and the idea that the climate change but the train has left the station, and so therefore it is also in capital's interest to go where new and fresh opportunities are. And it's, you know, I had to do a presentation on South Africa, but it's, you know, the way in which I suppose we talk about change, and it strikes me that you know, in our language and what kind of messaging, because I think if there was ever a time where we were ripe in this country particularly to think about the new social contract, to think about ways in which corporate South Africa can really play a more meaningful role in building democracy. Because I think what July has shown is that to corporate South Africa, it showed that the edifice is being torn down. And so we might not have the luxury of talking about a constitution if people don't step up. And so finding those ways within those areas, in those finding those opportunities, that I think requires, certainly I speak for myself, a little bit more thought, that it's got to go beyond the kind of, certainly the CSI, but even beyond the ESG and the kind of box ticking. But what is the purpose of the company? What is the orientation? So that I think is really important. And it provides an opportunity also for the way in which we talk about, for example, a basic income grant. I mean, it's quite interesting, the new Minister of Finance and what he said about a universal basic income grant. And that these things don't, I mean, I saw somebody's comment in the chat about this, but these things don't happen overnight. They are one through struggle, to use the trite phrase, but that it also requires research, and there's plenty of really solid research within civil society on how to implement a universal basic income grant. So it seems that the moment is ripe now for those kinds of conversations. But just on the point of somebody who's asked about the 12% contribution by workers, well, I'm assuming that that's the Minister of Social Development, who I think has appeared to gone rogue. So I'm not quite sure how that will contribute. But the other point I wanted to make is also about what we've been hearing around the weaknesses of the state, and Michelle, in your chapter, and how one rebuilds and strengthens the state. And so for those of us who work in the area of kind of constitutionalism, this is a very important moment to be making the case always for protecting, defending the Constitution, defending these rights, and also, again, trying to strengthen these institutions which have been hollowed out by having the right people in place. So it's a struggle on multiple levels. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Judith. That was great. Thank you. Richard.
Thanks, Michelle. Well, I guess I should stick to these two themes that I introduced, and which have picked up some responses, which I'm grateful for. So on the liberalism one, I'm grateful to Dale's point, and Jane Duncan's put something in chat, which is a very well articulated point, which I accept, which is that in essence, most rights advances have been through popular struggle and contestation, and I accept that and fully understand that. I think the point I was trying to make was that some of the gains, at least, of the sort of post-World War II international rule of law order can be described as liberal, or are described as liberal. Now, whether they have liberal roots or not is an interesting discussion and may not matter. The point is, that I was trying to make, is that there's a framework there. There's some good stuff in liberalism, whether it's emerged from pure progressive political lineage or not, which should not be discarded. In other words, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I guess it's a reflection of my own either political confusion or political maturation, that I increasingly think it's appropriate to draw from different strands of political philosophy. So there's a part of my approach to politics now which is decidedly liberal, and it may be the people in this discussion, none of you fall into this trap, but there are people, I believe, out there in the political spectrum who continue to put into cubicles different parts of the political ideological spectrum. So if, for example, you are a free press activist, you're seen as a liberal rights activist, and you can't be politically progressive. I mean, that's obviously nonsense. It's important for progressive politics that there is freedom of expression. And I really liked, and I omitted to say this, and it's important, I really like the interplay between Dale's chapter and Rodebe's chapter, which really looked at truth, the battle for truth and control of the intermediaries of truth, which is clearly such an important front line for the political period we're going through now, and is such an important part of the political economy that we need to understand it. And in the book sort of attaches various adjectives to democracy and to capitalism. One of the epithets that's used at the moment is the notion of surveillance capitalism, and the book by Zuboff, which I'm sort of trying to weave into my teaching on transparency, law, and governance, and that is this very complicated interplay between technology and new media, and then old freedoms around freedom of expression, but also newer freedoms around privacy and data protection. And it's a very complex, fast-moving, dynamic area, but it's a front line for the next political era, I would argue, and one that's crucial to engage with. On the corporate front, I agree with what Judith says. If you're gonna have a social compact, I think Michelle used that expression, that future progressive social compact has to involve the for-profit sector. I don't see how it can't for various reasons. And I'm happy to ascribe or sign up for Vish's formulation of that capital's participation in that project has to be on the people's terms, presumably to be articulated, negotiated, and determined. But yes, as a matter of principle, I would accept that and agree with that. I think that you might be surprised, Vish and others, just how much thinking goes into at least some corporate boardrooms and executive committees on these issues. You might be genuinely surprised at how progressive the thinking is. And of course, there are limits to it. And their limits are maybe not personal, they are systemic limits. There are limits around requirements for shareholder return and so on. But that is contested territory. And it can be contested. There is space, as many companies have shown now, for shareholder activism, as well as legislation and regulation, as well as leadership, above all else, which can really shift the way in which corporates deploy their power and their resources in very different directions. Now, I feel very strongly about this, and I'm sorry if I offend anybody by what I'm saying here. If there are people on the left who are wanting to put blinkers on that say, no, we can't touch the evil empire of corporate world, then I'm afraid you're not going to, with all due respect, and be able to construct a political project that will have substance and will be able to act with the necessary scale, at the necessary scale and urgency that the various crises, particularly the climate crisis, require. They have to be part of that, in my view. And some of them are, and they're moving fast. And capital, if we're going to have capital, and no one yet in this conversation suggested we're actually going to outlaw capital or overthrow capitalism. In which case, if we've got capital, we have to deal with it. And moreover, we have to, like a Tai Chi artist, shift its energy in a different direction. We have to deflect it away from the bad stuff, its carbon obsession, etc., into the good stuff. There's potential for that. I'm not saying it's going to a miracle cure. I'm absolutely not. But there is a potential there that needs to be exploited very strategically and very mindfully. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
Sorry, one last point. I'm so sorry.
Quick, right.
And people trust businesses more than they used to. The Edelman Trust Index, which comes out annually, the global index, now puts corporates at the top of the list of sectors that people trust. That is, 20 years ago, that would have been unthinkable. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. This really makes me think we need to have a seminar on this particular issue, a seminar on its own on this particular issue. Okay, so I'm going to let Vish do. I had a chat with him on a direct line, and he's going to just respond. And for time, then we'll give Vish a response to any of the other questions and to the panelists, and then I'll just do some concluding remarks because we want to really stick to time. It's a Sunday afternoon, and we want people to be able to enjoy the rest of their afternoon. Okay, Vish.
Just the 3 quick points. So Richard, I'm not sure what methodology the Edelman Index used and so on, but there's a lot of distrust vis-a-vis corporations as well. We're seeing it even in the context of the pandemic, in different shades of the sort of anti-vaxxer spectrum. For example, there's one current that really doesn't trust pharmaceutical capital for legitimate reasons. In the United States, there are many who kind of critique pharmaceutical capital and how it's bankrupted the FDA, et cetera, et cetera. We're seeing it in anti-pollution struggles and so on and so on. I mean, one of the myths of neoliberalism that it has entrenched and reduced to common sense, actually, is that capital is the harbinger of democracy, the guardian of democracy. It is the custodian of democracy. I think that's a fallacy, actually. Corporations in themselves are highly authoritarian, hierarchical institutions in society. And so we got to burst that myth. That doesn't mean we're about to outlaw capital and corporations. But I think that neoliberalism has gone too far. And actually the real guardians, the real custodians of democracy are the people, not corporations. And this is what the democratic Marxism project's all about, is to affirm that. The subaltern gives lifeblood to democracy. My second quick point is that, Samantha asked about rights of nature. So in the 3rd volume of the democratic Marxism series on climate, Pablo Solon, who's been a key advocate of the rights of nature. He was the ambassador of Bolivia in the climate negotiations. He wrote a chapter in that volume, and I encourage everybody to look at it. And he breaks with an anthropocentric understanding of rights and kind of grounds the rights of nature in an ecological framing, in a deep ecological framing, recognizing that there are other life forms out there, and they have to have an equivalence. And they have to be recognized, whether it's rivers and other ecosystems, they have to be recognized. And the rights of nature discourse and politics has, if you like, a grounding in a lot of indigenous cosmology, in a lot of indigenous activism and radicalism today. So I think there's a richer basis for thinking about the rights of nature. And the links, of course, to feminism, the links to reproduction, and so on. And I think that's important. My final point is this, is that I think we're also at a point where we have to rethink in the mechanical kind of sequence of how politics works, even on the left. So movements, then state power. On the other hand, parties, and then state power. I think that movementism and partyism both have to be problematized. We need to think in terms of a new generation of agential political forms that have to come to the fore, that bridge publics and social forces from below, but also state power. And there's a room for further debate on this question. And thank you.
Great, wonderful. There's also some great discussion in the chat. So, okay, I will take it upon us that we will have another seminar on these issues. Okay. I will give my vote of thanks now. I would like to begin by thanking the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. Yes, Jan Leidecker we're a huge fan of him, and he's supported this wholeheartedly, but so did some of his predecessors. We've been journeying on the democratic Marxism series with the RLF since, I think it's 2011 or 2012. It's been, I think it's 2011, so it's been a decade of their support. I also want to give a very special thanks to the National Institute for the Humanities and the Social Sciences. They also have been supporting the series, and together both of these have been the entities that have made it possible to put this open access anywhere, downloadable anywhere in the world. So thanks very much to both the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and to the NIHSS. I would like to also thank Copac and Jane, who organized our original workshop, and Charles. Thanks very much, Charles, for organizing today's lunch. And of course, I would like to thank Vich Press for supporting the DM series, the Democratic Marxism series, and a special thanks to Roshan, Veronica, Kirsten, Karina, and also a big thanks to the editors, Inga and Lee, for their wonderful editing work. I'm also very happy to say that, I've already said this, but I really want it to be clear, all of the volumes are open access, so you can get them. And I want to, I'm happy to say that Vich Press has been very supportive of this process. So, you know, of course, if you're like me, I like books, so I still want to have a book. And I'm very happy to say that the books are available in stores soon. It just came off the printers. In fact, we just got our own copy on Friday, so it's just getting out there. Okay, so then I would like to thank our wonderful panelists for their insightful contributions. This was actually far exceeded my expectations. And Judith and Richard, you were really both amazing. And to the audience, so you know, there's going to be a Daily Maverick series on this. So we all are going to put out 1,000 word pieces, so shorter pieces. And Judith and Richard's responses will also be part of that. And then I want to thank the audience. It's amazing. We had 77 attendees. It's dwindled a little right now, but it's incredible to have that many at any book launch, but also on a Sunday afternoon. And then most of all, I want to once again, thanks to the contributors for really helping make this an amazing volume. It was a wonderful group of people to work with. And yeah, so I really thank all of you for being part of this project. Okay. We are exactly at 4:30, so I would like to say goodbye. Have a lovely rest of your Sunday, and download the book, enjoy it, read it, engage it, and yeah, we look forward to hearing feedback. And thanks, Judith and Richard.
Thanks, Michelle. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Judith, Richard, and everybody. Take care.
Fish.
Bye.